Hello, good morning, students. I am your English teacher here with the topic direct speech and indirect speech. Now, before we move on to our lecture, it is very important to know what will be our today's objectives. Our today's objectives will be number 1, understanding direct and indirect speech. 2, need of learning direct and indirect speech. 3. Identifying direct and indirect speech. 4. Rules of change from direct to indirect speech. 5. Examples and exercises. After the objectives, now we're going to be looking at the direct and indirect speech or narration. We can even call direct and indirect speech, and we can even call it direct and indirect narration. Speech and narration are both same. But before we move on, it is very important to know exactly what speech is. Speech is communication. Speaking, writing, conversation are forms of speech. Communication could be done by the writer or speaker by himself or herself, or the writer or speaker might refer to other person's speech. When we refer to what others have to say in the past, there are two ways of doing it, either in a directive way or in indirective way. So one thing is very clear, that speech is a way of communicating, and it could be done in two manners, in direct manner or indirect manner. Looking at my second point, repetition of the original communicator's, writer or speaker, words as it is within the quotation marks, it is known as a directed speech. When I am delivering the exact words in my dialogue, therefore I will be adding quotation marks to it, therefore it will be called direct speech. Moving on to the third point, indirect speech. Indirect speech is expressing the content of others without quoting them, and there are certain rules about how to do this. In other words, indirect speech is when you are actually converting those exact words into other to tell what the other person was speaking about. So far we have learned what speech is, what direct speech is, what indirect speech is. Before we move on, it is even very important to us to know why indirect is important. Why can't we not leave it as a direct sentence? Why do we need to convert it into indirect form? So, what is the need of the indirect speech? The need of indirect speech is that at times, sometimes we do not have the exact words of the person's speech and we cannot reproduce the original speech. So we have no option but to go for indirect speech. It does happen. When we have such situations where we need to convert the exact dialogues into the other form to tell the third person that what was the first person saying, so there and then what we are actually doing is that we are converting the direct into indirect form. So in our today's learning practice, we will have the direct speech sentences available, and we will learn the rules of the conversation so that we are able to apply in future. We will look at converting statement and questions, requests or instructions or advice from direct to indirect speech. For example, Ben said, "I have a dental appointment this evening." I've written direct speech after that. That means I am saying that this sentence is direct sentence. Reason? Why? Because I am quoting the exact words of what Ben said. Ben said, is the remark. He's the boy who's speaking. What is he saying? He is saying, I have a dental appointment this evening. Therefore, I've added a comma. I have added the quotation marks. This is showing that this is a direct speech. Therefore, when you look at the second sentence, Ben said that he had a dental appointment that evening. Therefore, I have converted it into indirect. Reason one is that I have removed the quotations. I've added a conjunction there by saying Ben said that he had. It is very obvious that whenever we are converting direct into indirect, we are changing their time as well. The word spoken by a boy or man was maybe a minute ago, a second ago. Therefore, I'm telling the other person what that boy or girl said a minute ago. So therefore, my time will change accordingly. So as for there's no commas, there's no quotations, there's a conjunction that there, and then I'll start calling it indirect speech. Now, what I want you to do is to grab up your copies and observe the sentences. And when you're observing the sentences, keep my lecture, my words in your mind. Looking at these sentences, pick out which one is direct and which one is indirect. So you must have done the observation. Now let's look into the sentences in detail. Harry said, I am very tired now. We may quote this as actual words in inverted commas by placing a comma before the remark. As I mentioned before, there's a remark, Harry said, there's a comma, and there and then we're opening and closing a quotation in the end. But therefore, this sentence will be titled as direct speech. Now moving on to the second sentence. Harry said that he was very tired then. I have written it as an indirect speech. Why? We may report what he said without quoting the exact words. We have reported it without the quoting of his exact words. The commas and the quotations are not there. Again, this will be indirect. Just a quick exercise, just to know whether we are able to identify whether the sentence is direct or indirect speech. Let's look at the question 1. Mr. West said, I am very tired. This is direct speech. Why? Because we're using a comma, a quotation, and we're not reporting anything. This is an exact words of Mr. West. 2. He says that he is glad to be there that evening. No commas, no quotations, no exact words. That in the middle showing that this is not the exact words. It has been reported. Therefore, this will be known as indirect. Number 3. She said to him, I called you up, but you didn't answer an hour ago. Again, this is direct speech. Reason? Quotation marks. Let's move on to number 4. He said that he had been reading a novel. I will call it as indirect. Reason? Conjunction in the middle. Therefore, no quotations, no commas. There, it is very clear that it is indirect speech. Moving on to the last, 5th, David said that he was going to the library then. Again, this will be, I know you must be very right, it is indirect speech. Reason, no commas, no quotations, with a conjunction in the middle. That is that. Well done, everyone. Now, it is very important to know the rules before we start converting the direct into indirect. We're going to be looking at it in stepwise. So let's move on to step number 1. Step number 1 is called identify. Identify the reporting verb and the reported verb from the given sentence, like the quoted part of the sentence is reported speech and other non-quoted is reporting speech. So there are two parts of it. Whenever there's a direct sentence given to you, you know one part is when it's inside the quotation marks, that means this is the reported thing that I need to convert, and there's another that is without the quotation that will be known as to refer. So you need to know what is what when you're the first step is to identify what is the quotation saying, what is the other thing saying rather than the quotations. Step 2. Punctuation rules. The mark of quotation is omitted, comma is used in some cases. The mark of exclamation is converted into full stop. So there are certain rules of punctuation. At times we do use a comma, at times we do not. It depends on what sort of a sentence it is, but usually we're not using commas and we're not using quotation marks as well. Unless until there are very rare cases where we do end up using commas. The mark explanation is converted into full stop. This is very important for us to know whenever we're converting a direct sentence into indirect sentence. Therefore, we will be using only one punctuation that will be full stop, whether you're converting an exclamatory sentence into indirect, whether you're converting a question into indirect. Therefore, we should remember that it will turn into full stop. The other rules. Step 3. Use of that. As I mentioned before, we're going to be using the conjunction that between the reported speech and reporting speech. However, in question sentences, it is not used. When we're converting a question into the other form, we usually do not use the word that. We use other forms like told, questioned, and so on, where we are telling in the upcoming slides that what sort of reporting speeches will be used. Step 4. The pronoun changes. Pronouns are changed in indirect speech. All three forms of pronouns are changed according to the nature of the sentence. Obviously, when I'm converting my direct into indirect, therefore I'm referring what the man or the girl was saying to the other person. So therefore my pronouns will continuously change. I will convert into he. Moving on to the further rules. Step 5. Rules for tenses. Direct and indirect speech has some rules with tenses. While changing, you must learn how to change as per rules. Direct into indirect in present, past, or in future tense. So according to the sentences, our tenses do change because obviously, again, I mentioned before, we're converting the direct into indirect. The exact words that the man has said a second ago or maybe a minute ago, definitely it will change its tenses while I am delivering it to the other man. Step 6. Modal changes. Modal verbs are changed in indirect speech like can into could, may into might, must into had to. However, some modals like would, could, might, should, ought to are not changed in indirect speech. So there are certain modal verbs that do change, some do not change. The last rule, that is step 5, adverbs changes. There are some rules for changing the word showing time and place in direct speech into indirect speech. Words like today, yesterday, or tomorrow are changed into that day, the previous day, and the next day, respectively. To understand our rules better and how it should be applied, we'll be looking into some exercises where we're going to be looking at direct speech and indirect speech and how a direct speech is converted into indirect form and how we are applying the rules accordingly. Looking at the first sentence, it says direct sentence, that is, again, the quotation open, says, my son is graduating next week. She said with a great excitement. Therefore, it's a direct, we got our quotations on and how we're going to convert it into indirect. She said with a great excitement that her son was graduating the next week. What I simply did, I changed the pronouns, I changed the tense by adding was to it. The adverb changed into the next week. This is the way I had been doing the changes. The that conjunction came in the middle. So when we're converting it to indirect, the tenses are changing, the adverbs are changing, and we're adding a conjunction right there in the middle. Again, second example, let's look into it quickly. Direct, I quit my job a week ago. He confessed to his wife. Indirect, he confessed to his wife that he had quit his job a week ago. You can see in the direct I used the word I, and when I was converting into indirect, it turned into he had. A week ago converted into week ago, and we added a word that in the middle. That is the conjunction. Move on and observe the more conversations. Here we have provided you around four exercises, four examples here, where you can see how continuously the changes are being occurring, how a pronoun is changing, how the tense is changing, how an adverb is getting affected, how a modal verb is getting affected, how the use of the conjunction is, how I am omitting the punctuations continually. So all the 7 rules that we had learned before are getting applied in here. I would request you to go through each and every example carefully by looking and seeing how it is converted differently. Now, so what were the exact changes we were doing on the exercises before? Number 1, reported speech changes. This is very important. Number 1, I've written direct speech, and the second is reported speech. So we have a sentence with quotations that is known as a direct speech. Reported speech is when I am reporting the exact words to the other person. Therefore, in the other terms, we call it indirect sentence. So when we are talking about direct sentence, we have a simple present. This simple present is converting into simple past. The present progressive is converting into past progressive. You can see how indirect is different and how the reported speech is getting different. Looking all the way to down, ago even turns before, even looking it in the middle, now goes then. The other changes we are doing is actually the conversion table, that is the adverbs and adverbial phrases of time and then. When we're doing direct speech, we use the words such as now, and then indirect, it converts into then. Today becomes that day, this becomes that, these, those, yesterday's the day, a week ago, a week before, last weekend, the previous weekend. Again, depending on the sentences, and these will be continuously changing, coming all the way till the end. Here becomes there. I hope you were able to understand today's lecture. Thank you so much.